one of the reasons we created this show, not only to speak to our issues, but to provide an opportunity for folks like Ray and Brandon and Brittany to be able to speak to these concerns as well, is because we need to be able to tell our own story. Well, the Black press has always been at the forefront of telling our own story. Of course, played a huge role in World War I, World War II, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. And you know, the first Black newspaper was founded in 1827. The first editors were John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, free-born African Americans. Again, the first editors of Freedom Journal, the first Black-owned and operated newspaper, which was launched in March of 1827. South Carolina journalist John McCrae and his allies at the Lighthouse and Informer challenged their readers to rebel and fight. Folks, Newspaper Wars is a book that chronicles the role journalism played in the fight for civil rights in South Carolina. And the author, Sid Bedingfield, joins us right now. Sid, glad to have you on Roland Martin Unfiltered. And one of the reasons why I thought it was important to have you here talking, how? Do we have Sid?
All right, yeah, I hope so.
Got it. We got you. So, Sid, one of the reasons I wanted to have you here to talk about this book, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to connect this generation with the Black press historically and why we have to have Black media outlets like this one that tell our story, where many of these stories often don't get the level of intensity from mainstream cable and broadcast news or even a lot of our major newspapers.
Well, I think that's true. One thing I wanted to do in the book was to give due credit to John Henry McCrae and the Lighthouse and Informer. Sometimes in the study, even within the study of the Black press, the African-American press, the Southern Black press of the first half of the 20th century is sometimes disregarded. It's seen as always being cautious, conservative, accommodationist, unwilling to push for civil rights forcefully, understandably, under the oppression of Jim Crow rule at that time. But John Henry McCrae stepped out of that model. He launched his paper actually in Charleston, was aggressive in fighting for equal rights for African Americans, from demanding it. And he played, in his paper, a sort of an unheralded role in launching a very successful civil rights effort in South Carolina in the late 30s and particularly in the 40s. The movement flourished in the 40s, had some real success in the 40s and early 50s, and then was sort of fractured and dispersed by fierce white backlash, especially in the years after Brown v. Board of Education. But John McCrae, I think, is a hero who doesn't get enough credit. Is one of those Black editors in the Deep South, not just the South, but in the Deep South, who actually helped launch the civil rights movement there.
You know, Brittany, is very interesting, and I want you to ask a question of Sid as well here. I look at present day when I see a lot of these stories and these things crop up, and then I'll watch these documentaries and I'll see these folks from mainstream media talking about these issues, and I'm going, y'all know many of us who are in Black media started these movements, got these things going. I mean, matter of fact, look, it was even a trip watching the Trayvon Martin documentary that Jay-Z was involved with, and I'm sitting here looking at people, I'm going, that's not what happened. I know the Black people who were driving this thing on social media. Yeah. So it's very interesting, like even present day, how those of us in Black media get ignored when we actually launch a lot of these major stories. Go ahead with your question, Brittany.
Well, you know, we have an oral tradition, right? We are storytellers dating all the way back to our ancestors. And so it is not a novel idea whatsoever that we would be at the forefront of telling the most important stories of the day. You know, Sid, my first internship in college was actually at the St. Louis American, which is our leading Black paper in my hometown. And it's an institution that I continue to work with and that I'm deeply proud of. And I would love for folks to know, whether they are Black or not Black, how they can support Black newspapers, Black media outlets, and ensure that our stories are heard.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer how they can support it now, although certainly reading it, we've seen a resurgence of African-American media online, right? The Root, Rio, and other things as well. There is a kind of a story in the historiography of the Black press that says You know, in the 60s, when the white press began to at least marginally cover the African-American community to some extent, cover civil rights to some extent, that the black press, quote, died, or at least withered away significantly. But the fact is it didn't wither away. And we're actually seeing a resurgence now. So there are a lot of places now where the African-American press, I think, thrives in a way that it hasn't in the past 20 or 30 years.
Ray?
Sid, this is Ray Baker. I'm interested in something that you mentioned, particularly the question of black journalists in the Deep South and how you noted the delineation there. Many of the viewers may be well familiar with Ida B. Wells and how she risked her life to tell stories about lynching. But can you tell our viewers about some more of the freedom fighters who were journalists, who risked their lives, not just in their reporting, but in putting themselves on the front line of stories that some of the white press weren't covering?
Absolutely. John Henry McCrae is a great example in South Carolina. Another man, Lewis Austin, the Carolina Times in North Carolina, a little bit older than McCrae, not much though. Launched his paper in the early 30s, actually in 1927. Took over a paper there, started running it, and again, like John Henry McCrae, he was an aggressive proponent for equality at a time when lynchings were prevalent, when the danger was great, when law enforcement was not essentially there present for African Americans. Some would say that's still the case at times now, but certainly then it was common. These guys were out there telling stories that were angering the status quo, the Jim Crow rule in those areas. Lewis Austin certainly in South Carolina, in North Carolina. One thing about in Atlanta, you have the Scott family, which ran the Atlanta World, which became the Atlanta Daily World in the 30s. One of the largest African-American papers in the nation, certainly did its part to raise issues, but it was really a much more conservative paper than the Lighthouse Informer in South Carolina or Lewis Austin's Carolina Times in North Carolina. C.A. Scott, the Scott family, they were sort of, as today, Atlanta had a large African-American middle class, burgeoning middle class at that time. The Scott family was not really willing to sort of push the issues to the point of confrontation. They always wanted to negotiate, despite the existence of segregation and second-class status in Atlanta at that time. So that idea that Southern African-American newspapers, Deep South African-American newspapers were conservative, caution, and even accommodationist at that period really does sort of come from that reputation that the Atlanta Daily World had. Atlanta Daily World was not sure that it really wanted to support, for example, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund's effort to pursue the Brown case all the way. They were adamant proponents of equal pay for black teachers in the South at that time. But they really did not want to get rid of the dual educational system. And you had, I think it's no surprise, public opinion in the African-American community was not monolithic at that time. And so you had these newspapers sort of fighting out the battles within the community about what strategy should we take going forward. And the Scott family took a much more cautious and conservative approach. But you did have people like John Henry McCrae and others who wanted to go in a different direction, wanted to actually push for full equality. And eventually they got it, but they paid a price too. I can tell you some stories about
Brandon,
how the
real
price
quick. What's your question, Brandon, real quick?
Paid as well.
Well, no, I just like your point about not monolithic and the different viewpoints in the black community. But the only point I'll ask is now, fast forward to today in the age of Trump, and what issues do you think currently going on would be covered differently if the black press, had more of a voice, I guess, competing against the white mainstream media that sometimes cover the issues? What kind of issues today do you think would be covered differently or not being covered enough by the mainstream white press?
Oh, I think
about 30 seconds, Sid. Go ahead.
Okay, police. I would go with police treatment of African Americans. I think immigration, which also resonates with the African American community as well, would be treated different. I think there would be a lot of issues that would have more sustained, what I'm old school here, front page coverage would get a lot of more attention than maybe they get from the mainstream press. They wouldn't let up as much as the mainstream press does in trying to be very even-handed on some of these issues where Trump is frankly trying to generate racial resentment as a way to gain political leverage. I think they would be much more out front in making that an actual political issue.
And you're absolutely correct, which is why we speak truth to power right here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Sid, I certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. Again, folks, pull the graphic up of the book. It is called Newspaper Wars, Civil Rights and White Resistance in South Carolina, 1935 to 1965 by Sid Bedingfield. Thank you so very much, Sid.